Hi, I'm Paul. Welcome back to another Blazor build. Today we look at how to build an accessible paging component that has the option to use buttons for data grids and tables, or links for when you want to display page search results such as list as product details like an online store, allowing the user to open links in a new window or save the page as a favourite, for example. Currently on screen are 4 pages, all bound to the same variable, so they are in sync, showing the differing visual options. Before we go through these, I thought we would start at the end by looking at an example of the pager being used by the Blazor template's default weather table. I have left the code intact, just increasing the weather collection items from 5 to 500, adding a text box for a filter above the table, and then adding the paging component below the table. The filter uses a timer for a simple debounce, so when there is a pause of typing of around 250 milliseconds, all the columns within the weather collection are checked to see if they contain the filter text, with the paging parameters being updated accordingly. This pager is using the large size without the go to page input box. I have not altered the table at all, it's just the default one, so tabbing from the filter will go straight to our pager. Let's turn on the free screen reader NVDA and listen to what it sees.
Speech mode beeps. Speech mode talk.
I will tab to the pager, navigating to and selecting number 5 using the enter key, followed by going to and selecting page 7 using the space key.
Filter records, edit blank. Weather results pager navigation landmark list with 11 items, previous button unavailable. Current page 1. 2 button. 3 button. 4 button. 5 button. Page 5, entries 21 to 25 of 500, current page 5. 6 button. 7 button. Page 7, entries 31 to 35 of 500, current page 7.
The screen reader announced the button number as focus was moved, announcing the information to the left of the pager when we selected a page, along with being informed that it is the current page. The screen reader announced the information to the left of the page as the containing element has the ARIA role of status, the equivalent to that of the ARIA live attribute with the value of polite. It announced the selected page as the current page, as the selected item has the ARIA current attribute set to page. Both overflow items are now visible, with the current page being in the center. I will now use Shift-Tab to go back to the filter box and type in a non-existing entry.
6, 5, 1, previous filter records, edit blank. C, page O, D, E, no entries found.
The screen reader again announces the information to the left of the pager, no entries found. I will now type -3, as that value could occur in either the centigrade or Fahrenheit columns.
E, D, O, C, page 1, entries 1 to 5 of 500. Dash, 3, page 1, entries 1 to 5 of 11, filtered from 500, total entries.
This time the screen reader announces page 1 entries 1 to 5 of 11, filtered from 500 total entries. The string values used for the information are configurable with placeholders for the numbers. I will now tab back to the pager and go to page 3 to display the last page of information.
Weather results pager navigation landmark list with 5 items, previous button unavailable. Current page 1. 2 button. 3 button. Page 3, entries 11 to 11 of 11, filtered from 500, total entries, current page 3.
The screen reader now announces page 3, entries 11 to 11 of 11 filtered from 500.
Speech mode on demand. Speech mode off.
I'll go back to the home page where I will demonstrate using the other configured pages, briefly explaining some of the accessibility issues and why I built the pager in the way that I did. After which we will then go through the code so you can comfortably build your own pager from scratch, or use my code freely available on GitHub as a starting point, altering it as you see fit. The first pager is set to large, with the go to page input box displayed. This pager also uses links instead of buttons, so on clicking a link the address bar will be updated, with the user also being able to right click on a link to open it in a new page or window. Before showing this pager, I will navigate to the last pager on the page and then back to the first, performing various actions as I go.
Speech mode beeps. Speech mode talk. Large results page and navigation landmark. List. Go to page. Edit enter key to activate. Compact results page and navigate. Next button. Page 2. Entries 6 to 10 of 50,000. Page 3. Entries 11 to 15 of 50,000. Previous button. Page 2. Entries 6 to 10 of 50,000. Page 1. Entries 1 to 5 of 50,000. Next button. Compact. Previous. Go to page. Edit enter key to activate. 5. 5. 0. Page 50. Entries 246 to 250 of 50,000. Medium results page and navigation. 10. 4. 1 button. Page 1. Entries 1 to 5 of 50,000. 1 button. Current page. Speech mode on demand. Speech mode off.
The next and previous buttons on all sizes of the pages, as well as the input boxes, retain focus when activated, as opposed to moving the focus to the pager buttons. Because of this, I purposely added the text page in the information details to the left of the pager, so when these methods are employed, screen reader users would still be advised of the page, as well as knowing something actually happened. You would be surprised at how many so-called accessible pages that I came across during my research that, when using these types of navigation methods, made no announcements, leaving the users completely in the dark as to whether or not anything actually happened. I also made the decision not to use ARIA labels or prepend numbers with hidden text, such as page or go to page, as this is both unnecessary and changes the element's accessible name. If the visible text does not match the accessible name, then users of voice-activated software would need to take additional steps in order to use the pager, unless they can guess the accessible name for their voice commands. Now that we have heard all of the announcements that the screen reader can make, I will turn it off and briefly show the first pager that uses links instead of buttons. I kept the styling the same for both links and buttons, but used the prevent default event modifier on the event tags, so I could provide the href with the absolute URL, but not have the default navigation take place. The underlying code just uses Blazor's navigation manager in order to have the address bar URL updated. I will move to and select page 6, but then open page 8 in a new window by using the browser's context menu. The home page of the second application instance checks the URL on initialization and updates the current page variable that all of the paging components are bound to, so everything works as expected. As a heads up, whilst making the video, I changed my mind regarding what the go to page input box should display when changing pages. I have now put it back to what it was before I made the video, so its display now stays in sync with the current page. The options were to make it blank, do nothing, or keep it in sync, but you can easily alter this behaviour to your preferred choice. Before we look at the project structure and code, one last word regarding accessibility and the ARIA authoring guidelines and practices. Currently, there is no authoring guideline for a pager, and the demo just seen is a reduced version of what I originally built. Once you have built a few components following the guidelines, you notice that keyboard support for widgets made up of multiple parts follow a familiar scheme. You use the tab key to get to the component, and then keys such as the home, end, escape and arrow keys to navigate around the parts of the component, maybe with the tab key being used to navigate to a single roving index. My original pager followed this pattern, but I had forgotten one thing. My design used the nav element for its landmark role, as that seemed a common practice for pages, with users of assistive technologies being able to quickly navigate between landmarks on a page. However, in order to tell assistive technologies that my pager had custom keyboard support, I gave the nav element the role of application, without realizing that in doing so the nav element would lose its landmark role. I was in two minds as to whether to keep the keyboard support minus the landmark role, or keep the landmark and ditch the custom keyboard support. In the end, I opted for the landmark role, presuming users of assistive technologies will be more familiar with using the tab key on pages given the lack of the ARIA authoring guidance. I have kept the code just in case we eventually get an ARIA role of Pager, or at least some guidance via an ARIA authoring pattern. Okay, time to look at the home page, weather page and app.razor file before going through the project structure and the code. The 4 components on the home page do not include all of the available parameters, as I have used a lot of the available default values. I will go through these parameters when we get to the component's code. The important thing to note is that the component uses two-way binding for the current page and uses the Blazor's convention of appending changed to the parameter name to form its event name. You can use either the bind syntax used by the last component or the combination of the current page parameter to set the value and the current page changed event to get the value. The ARIA pager label parameter is the text for an ARIA label attribute added to the nav element that screen readers will announce on entering the pager. The display info parameter allows you to completely remove the information shown to the left of the pager or to show it with or without the announcements. I added this option so a pager could be added to both above and below a single data grid. As each component manages its own live region, if you left them both on, in the aforementioned scenario, the user would hear this information twice, once for each pager. You may have noticed code within the uninitialized method. This is the code that set the page number to page 8 when I opened the link in a new window. Let's now take a look at the component on the weather page that catered for the data table's filtered records. The paging component needs to be supplied with the count of items, the item count, how many items per page there are, and the total item count. In general, when filtering is not used, the total item count and the item count will be the same. They will differ when filtering is used. The total item count is used for the filtering message and should not change. The item count can change and you should use a variable for the parameter as shown in the demo. As you can see, I added 2 or 3 event handlers to wire everything up for the filtering process and debounce, but other than that, the code is just the templates code. Within the event handlers, I update the item count and current page variables, which in turn update the paging component. There's nothing else of importance to discuss here, so let's move on to the app.razor file and briefly discuss the project structure. The only thing to note in this file is the path used to get our component style sheet, which uses the content/assembly name syntax to get the embedded resource from the component project. This solution, like most of my YouTube videos, uses the .NET 8 web app template, selecting the interactive server option with the location set to global, but any interactive project would do. After this, I then added a new Razor class library project named blazorbuilds.components to the solution, updating the server project's reference and both import Razor files with the appropriate using statements when required. I use the same project types and naming conventions, so once you have seen one of my videos, it's easier to follow along in the next as you are already familiar with the structure and naming convention used, and some of my coding quirks. In the components project, I added my usual assets and CSS subfolder to the web root folder for the CSS that gets output from our Sassy CSS. I added the familiar assets and SCSS subfolder for my Sassy CSS files that create the CSS file that gets output to the aforementioned CSS folder. Within the SCSS folder, we have 3 partial Sassy CSS files denoted by the leading underscore and the main file that uses these to form the output. The root partial file just includes a few global variables that is used by the component. I have used these global variables as these are the same ones that I use in other components. Doing this allows me to change a property such as color and have that change reflected in all of the components that use that variable. The SVG icons partial file just includes classes that wrap the SVG data used by the component for the next and previous buttons. The pager partial file contains most of the CSS for our component. I am not going to explain much, but will point out anything that's noteworthy. I use the B.E.M block element modifier naming convention for my CSS, and the pager class forms the block part of this. As we are using Sassy CSS, for those not familiar with this, the ampersand is not the same as the native CSS nesting. The ampersand denotes the parent selector, with the text after the ampersand being concatenated to the parent selector's name to form the class name. For example, ampersand _label when output becomes the class named pager _label. Line 14. Although I typically use B.E.M modifying classes, when the information element to the left of the pager is not shown, rather than use a modifier to change justify content from space between, which forces the information to the left and the pager buttons to the right of the screen, to flex end to force a single item to the right, I thought in this instance using the only-child pseudo element would be sufficient. For those wondering about the gap property of one rem when space between has been used, this is mainly in case of wrapping, as the gap also applies to the vertical axis. On line 37 I used a nested has, so when the input box was read-only I could change the colour of its label to match. However, looking at it now, I think this can be simplified. I will update the code if I remember before it's uploaded to GitHub. Lines 80 and 85 are a couple of B.E.M modifying classes that alter the buttons to be perfectly square or perfectly round. These are nested inside our ampersand __ selector. The ampersand -- round modifier when output will become the class pager _ button -- round. The next few classes are focus related, dependent on the area attributes used. Last on line 125 is yet more of my life lost to Bootstrap due to all of their overrides and resets. I keep meaning to use my own template instead of Blazor's, but felt that might make it harder for everyone to be able to follow along. The main SCSS file just has the use directives to tell the preprocessor to include the partial files in its output. Next is the common folder with its two subfolders, extensions and seeds. The extensions folder just houses the utility extensions class, which contains a couple of Boolean extensions, so I can have neat one-line if statements. I'll skip this so as not to bore you. Within the seeds folder we have the enums file that contains 5 enumerations for our component parameters. Most are self-explanatory. The page display size numeric values are used to control the maximum number of numbered buttons or links. The style as enum is something that I now add to all of my components for theming purposes. It just lets me know if the component is on a fixed dark area or if it's dynamic, which expects to change with dark or light modes. Next is the global values file that contains string constants used by the component and a single static helper method for my theming scheme. The only thing to take note of is the pager count format string and pager filter count string that are for the old style string format method. The count format gets provided with the current page number, the start of the item range, the end of the item range, like 11 to 15. As well as the item count, with the filter string being provided with the total item count. A more robust solution would be to use named placeholders and then do a string replace, but as I only use the default value, that can be an exercise for the viewer. We then have a pager folder for our component. For this component, the razor file is only used for the markup, with a separate file added for its code behind. There's quite a bit of markup due to having the choice of either a button or link, necessitating numerous if-else blocks. From a logical perspective, all we have is the containing nav element that has a span for a visible live region that goes on the left, and then an unordered list that goes on the right. The nav element has an ARIA label that the screen reader will announce, with the span having the role of status, equivalent to the ARIA live attribute with the value of polite, forming the visible live region to be announced by the screen readers. The unordered list has an optional input box followed by a previous button or link, then either a variable number of buttons or links or none if the page's size parameter is set for a compact pager, with a subsequent next button or link at the end. I used the @key directive on all of the LI tags to aid Blazor's list mechanics so it knows what to update and when. The key down handler for the input box uses stop propagation to prevent the enter key from bubbling up. Regarding the input box, I have used the ARIA description attribute to provide a hint to screen reader users to press the enter key after inputting a page number. This attribute is still in draft, despite being available since 2017 and supported by all the major browsers and all of the screen readers that I looked at. The previous button or link both use the ARIA disabled attribute, which is then used to style a disabled look, as using the HTML disabled attribute would take the element out of the tab sequence so a screen reader user could tab over it without knowing. With ARIA disabled, the screen reader will announce that it's unavailable, which solidifies the fact that the preceding page was the first page. The span for the icon are marked with the ARIA hidden attribute to hide these from screen readers. The next button or link just mimics the previous element, but for the other direction. The content between the next and previous items is dependent on the pager being compact or otherwise, and if it's compact, then we just show the current page number and the last page number as text. For all other cases, we enter our for loop to generate the numbered buttons or links and any overflow items dependent on the number of pages. The getPageNumber method returns the page number to display and returns -1 to indicate the overflow item that may appear on the left, and -2 for an overflow item that may appear on the right of the central numbers. If it is an overflow item, we just put the content directly within the LI tag, as they are not in the tab order, but we still mark it with the ARIA disabled attribute along with an ARIA label. We do this so if a screen reader user is having the page read, they will be advised that this was an unavailable item, signifying skipped pages. If the number returned is the current page number, then we set the ARIA current attribute to the value of page to inform assistive technologies of this. But importantly, we update the @ref directive in order to be able to programmatically set focus to the element. These numbered items are moving, i.e. we could click on, say, number 10, which then may be 2 off the central number 8, which then becomes the central pager button, which now needs the focus. We continue the loop until all the slots are full. That's pretty much it for the markup. Let's move on to the code. As we wanted a code behind, we had to create a public partial class with the same name as the razor page, just appending .cs to page.razor to have it nested. The ARIA pager label parameter has already been mentioned. We mark this parameter with the editor required attribute to advise the user that this is a required parameter, not an optional one. The ARIA ellipse label is for the overflow items with the default value text of ellipse indicating skipped pages. The next and previous label parameters contain the text for those elements, the default text being next and previous respectively. The input label is the text shown next to the input box with the default text being go to page. The show input box parameter is self-explanatory. The parameters down to no records label have already been mentioned, with the no records label supplying the text to be used if there are no records that need paging, the default text being no entries found. All of the enums are self-explanatory, or we have already covered them. On line 32, we use property injection to get hold of the navigation manager, as this is .NET 8, but you can use constructor injection in .NET 9. Line 34 has the single element reference that gets updated with the current page element when an item is selected. The private fields down to line 43 are those that I consider only need setting during initialization, but you can alter this if you want the ability to dynamically change them. The IDs on line 45 and 46, just keep those items unique, as you could have multiple pages on the same page. The pager information field will contain the final string value used for the information displayed to the left of the pager. This, along with the fields ending on line 53, are set during each invocation of the onParametersSet method. During the one-time initialized invocation, we set fields to use the parameter values or default values if the parameter values were not supplied, throwing an exception if the user ignored the warning regarding the required ARIA pager label parameter. Next is the onParametersSet method that is called each time a parameter value changes and/or the parent re-renders, causing the child to re-render. There is another method, setParametersAsync, that is called before the parameters are assigned, but I tend to use the onParametersSet for simplicity. The setPagerInformation method, as its name suggests, just builds the value for the pager information field using string.doc format to replace the placeholders with the appropriate values. The updateURI_query_params method is called by links in the markup to create the URL for its href attribute. The getPageNumber method is the main routine that gets called from the markup to get the page numbers for each element or indicates an overflow item. I am not good at maths, so just like the first pager that I ever built, I did not like adding this routine, hence the simple step-by-step approach with the if statements. This is the smallest routine I could come up with, but please let me know if you can make a more succinct version. The requested page method updates the address bar URL via the navigation manager's navigate to method when a link has been clicked. This also causes the parent's onParameterSet method to be triggered. Regardless of type, link or button, the current page changed event is raised if there are event listeners attached. We then yield control, as we want Blazor to perform a render before the render after the method exits in order to get an updated element reference. We do this so we can properly set the focus to the new current page button or link. For the next, previous and input box, we do not need to move focus, so we can just exit the routine, as these set the optional move focus parameter to false. The handle input key down method, the event listener for the onKeyDown event attached to the input element, just checks if the enter key was pressed and then requests the appropriate page. To keep things simple, if the number is less than 1 or greater than the total number of pages, we just request page 1 or the last page respectively. Finally, we have a helper method to get the CSS classes used by the numbered elements. I just called everything buttons. Admittedly, this was before I decided to add links, so maybe a refactor to use the name link button may be in order, but again, I leave that as an exercise for the viewer. And with that, we are done. As usual, all of the code is freely available on GitHub with the links to the code in the video description below. Please feel free to leave good or bad comments, and I will do my best to answer any questions raised. Until next time, bye for now.